There are moments in history, buried beneath layers of time, where shadows linger, unseen forces that shape the world, leaving behind unsettling questions, unanswered and echoing through the centuries. Time doesn't erase them. It only deepens the mystery. It begins with a blinding light, August 6th and August 9th, 1945. The sky above Hiroshima and Nagasaki is torn apart, split by a force humanity had only begun to comprehend. The atomic bombs, named Little Boy and Fat Man, fell with a power the world had never seen before, enough to destroy entire cities in an instant. The dust settles, but the debate does not. Were these bombings a necessary evil, the only way to bring an end to World War II and save countless lives? Or were they a harbinger of an age in which humanity's very survival could vanish in a single flash of light, casting doubt on the morality of their use? The survivors, the Hibakusha, carry their stories, but the shadows of that decision still loom large over history. Past is more than a singular event. In the silent halls of forgotten empires, whispers of conquest and colonization spread like a dark stain across the map of the world. From the 15th century through the mid-20th century, European powers carved up continents, claiming lands that were never theirs to take. Those who walked the lands before the arrival of European ships, Africa, the Americas, Asia, are no longer here to tell their side of the story. Whole civilizations were wiped out, cultures extinguished, and yet we ask, was it civilization that came ashore or something more sinister? Did the so-called civilizing mission mask an erasure of history that ripples across continents to this day? The weight of that legacy still stirs, unseen but felt, haunting modern politics, social divisions, and national identities. Should the colonizers be held accountable, or is it too late to undo what has been done? Across oceans, bound in iron and forced beneath the decks of ships, an entire people were transported into a nightmare from which they could not wake. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, the transatlantic slave trade saw millions of African men, women, and children torn from their homes, their names and identities erased, their lives sold into brutal labor. The shadows of those ships stretch across the Atlantic even now, and the question lingers. Can reparations ever be enough to heal the deep wounds of slavery? Or is there a debt that can never truly be paid in full? Some argue the effects of the trade, of centuries of systemic oppression, are too vast to quantify. Others still refuse to acknowledge the depth of this historical trauma. And yet, the debate continues, a ghost that haunts the conscience of nations. Then, there are the shadows cast by institutions of faith. From the 12th century through the early 19th century, the Catholic Church stood at the helm of the Spanish Inquisition. Its robes, once symbols of faith, became stained by the fires of persecution. Heretics, dissenters, and non-Christians were dragged into the chambers of the Inquisition, where justice was swift and often fatal. But were these acts truly driven by a desire to purify the faith, or were they merely an excuse for the Church to assert control and consolidate power? Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the world, the methods used during the Inquisition raise unsettling questions. Were these trials ever about salvation, or were they something far darker, veiled in the language of faith? The Crusades, too, marched through history like a fevered dream. From 1096 to 1291, Christian knights embarked on a series of holy wars to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. But were they truly holy wars driven by the divine or something more? The motivations behind the Crusades are shrouded in complexity. Was it a battle for salvation or an insatiable thirst for power cloaked in the banners of religion? Beneath the armor and the crosses, there was blood, always blood. Kingdoms fell, cities burned, and the scars left behind are still felt in the geopolitical tensions of today. And then there are those who would deny the truth altogether. 1941 to 1945. The Holocaust, an atrocity so vast, so horrific, it defies comprehension. 6 million Jews, alongside millions of others, were murdered in Nazi concentration camps. But in the dark corners of society, there are those who whisper that it never happened, or that it was exaggerated. Revisionists, deniers, rewriting history to suit their own agenda. Holocaust denial is more than just the distortion of facts. It is an act of violence against memory itself. What is more dangerous, the act of forgetting, or the deliberate reshaping of history for those who choose not to believe? In America, the Civil War ended in 1865, but the legacy of the Confederacy never truly died. In the South, monuments still stand, Confederate flags still wave, symbols of a fractured nation. But what do they represent? For some, they are tokens of heritage, a link to a romanticized past. For others, they are reminders of a time when human beings were bought and sold as property. Whose memory do these relics serve? Are they pieces of history, or do they whisper of something unresolved, something dangerous that still simmers beneath the surface? Across the sea, famine gripped Ireland. 1845 to 1852, the Irish potato famine, a tragedy of epic proportions. 1 million dead, another million forced to flee. But the questions that remain are not about the potatoes. Instead, they are about the British Empire and its policies. Did the empire's indifference turn the famine into genocide? Were their hands, unseen and deliberate, that exacerbated the suffering of an already starving people? The answers are tangled in the pages of history, but the shadows of that famine still linger, in the diaspora and in the memories of those who survived. In the stillness of North America's plains and forests, treaties were signed with the ink of deceit. From the 17th century through the 19th century, European settlers made promises to indigenous peoples. Promises of land, protection, and peace. But those promises were broken, one after another. Entire nations of native peoples were uprooted, driven from their ancestral homes. The treatment of indigenous peoples remains a chapter of history that is glossed over, but the land remembers. The earth keeps secrets, and the spirits of those displaced have not been silenced. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, was a storm that shook the world. The people rose up, the monarchy fell, and heads rolled beneath the blade of the guillotine. But was this revolution truly a cry for liberty, or did it descend into chaos driven by anger and fear? The debate rages on. Was the violence necessary, or could there have been another way? One that did not leave rivers of blood flowing through the streets of Paris.
With more than 400 helicopters of its own, nothing can outrun the flying horse.
The jungles of Vietnam still hold their secrets too. 1955 to 1975, the Vietnam War. A war fought for freedom, they said, but was it? Or was it a war fought in the shadows of larger powers, a proxy for Cold War fears? The scars of that conflict remain, both in Vietnam and in the heart of American society. Was it all in vain, or is there something in the jungles of Vietnam that we have yet to truly understand? (1915 to 1923), the Armenian genocide remains a wound that has yet to fully heal. The Ottoman Empire carried out a systematic campaign of extermination, and yet, over a century later, the world still debates whether to call it what it was: a genocide. Some deny, others demand recognition. The ghosts of that tragedy are never far. The question of recognition still lingers in the air, heavy with the weight of the past. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, and with it, the world breathed a sigh of relief. But was it truly the end of something dark, or simply the beginning of a new chapter, filled with its own uncertainties and unseen consequences? The reunification of Germany brought hope, but it also raised questions that have yet to be fully answered. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was meant to bring peace. But in its wake, it left a bitter taste. From the ashes of that treaty, something monstrous rose: Nazi Germany. Did the harsh terms of the treaty plant the seeds for World War II? Or was its failure the result of something deeper, more insidious, waiting to emerge? South Africa, apartheid lasted from 1948 to 1994, a regime of racial segregation and oppression. The world watched, and the world waited. But what price was truly paid, and by whom? International actors, corporations, and governments all played a part, some in opposition, some in silent complicity. The legacy of apartheid still casts its shadow over South Africa, but the question of accountability remains. In the darkness of history, these questions remain. They are whispers, lingering in the places we dare not look too closely. We may think we know the answers, but somewhere, deep beneath the surface, the truth waits, silent, watching, and patient.